Welcome everyone to the new ESOTA webinar. We have the pleasure to welcome two fantastic chairmen, who were the former chair of the ESOTA, Professor Silke Walter and Professor Robin Lemons. Will be introducing you with the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to this ESOTA winter webinar. It's a great pleasure to have you here. My name is Silke Walter. I'm a German neurologist from Saarland University and a member at large with the ESO Executive Committee. And it is my very great pleasure to be here today with Robin Lemons from the University of Leuven in Belgium, who is a member of the board of directors with ESO and the chair of the ESOC planning group. In this webinar today, we will gain insight into stroke recovery trials, into new opportunities from European funding. We will gain methodological knowledge about mediation analysis. All our talks are planned for about approximately 15 minutes. And after the 3 talks we hear, we will have 15 minutes left for questions. So please put your questions into the Q&A box and we will address them during the discussion. It is my very great pleasure now to announce the first speaker, who is Amanda Farrin from the University of Leeds in the UK. Amanda is a statistician by background and trialist of over 25 years, huge experience. She is a professor of clinical trials and evaluation of complex interventions at the Leeds Institute of Clinical Trials. She is founder and director of the Complex Intervention Division for testing of complex health and social care interventions. So that something that is actually needed in very many countries. She is the principal investigator of multiple trials and studies, including a first adaptive platform trial to test non-pharmacological interventions for stroke rehabilitation and long-term care in the UK. And today, Amanda will speak about her experience with the platform trial, the LEAP project. Amanda, we are looking forward to hearing about your work and experience. Please, when you're ready.
Thank you. Is that sharing my slides okay?
That's fine.
I'll bring up the slideshow. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here today. I really do hope that I will be the principal investigator of this future platform trial, but today I'm going to tell you about all the work that we've undertaken to design such a trial. The work that I'm going to describe has been funded by the UK National Institute for Health Research under an acceleration award linked to the Health Technology Assessment Programme. And I'd like to acknowledge the big team really that we've worked with in order to do this work. Platform trials are incredibly complex, and as you can see, we have a huge number of people across the UK, including a really committed group of carers, family and patients, so stroke survivors, who've helped us develop this work. I'm sure for this audience I don't need to give you an awful lot of background, but as you no doubt be familiar, many people have a stroke every year and incidence rates are rising. But with better survival through improved emergency and hospital care, we now have increasing number of stroke survivors living with the after effects of stroke. And you'll be familiar with the sorts of problems that involves. And really in this research space, to date, evidence generation has been slow and potentially not as efficient as it could be, because it's typically used parallel group trials testing a single intervention against a control arm to improve post-stroke outcomes. And globally, there's been calls for more efficient stroke recovery research, potentially using complex adaptive designs that will then help us understand within single studies multiple interventions and their effectiveness and allow us to target multiple questions simultaneously. So we were funded to develop a UK platform trial to test several interventions that would improve outcomes for people living after stroke, in partnership, as you've seen from the acknowledgement slide, with stroke survivors, clinicians and researchers. And what we were aiming to do was develop a platform that would test multiple promising interventions using more efficient adaptive methods, align those interventions to priorities that have been set for stroke rehabilitation and long-term care research, and therefore at the end of the platform contribute to a better understanding of effective post-hospital stroke rehab models, and along with that the added benefit of transforming how we conduct future research. So we've had 12 months from Farrin money to develop this robust platform trial protocol and enable us to apply to our funders for the platform trial at the end of this month. And essentially what we're aiming to do with LEAP, the Life After Stroke platform, is to deliver a recovery trial like COVID, recovery platform trial as was delivered during COVID, but for people living with stroke. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the top 10 research priorities that have been set by the James Lind Alliance Priority Setting Partnership, they cover the very common problems encountered after stroke. So mental and emotional problems, cognitive problems, communication difficulties, fatigue, organisation of services, how we can help people adjust to the long-term impacts, what's the best place, time and amount of therapy, how we support stroke survivors better to work with care teams, interventions to improve strength and fitness, and also thinking about research around improving the stroke survivor and carer experience. So in our work, we set out with these 7 objectives, and I can't talk through all of the work today, but I am going to try to pick out the objectives that I've highlighted here on the slide in terms of our work to select and justify the interventions we test within the platform, our work to consider the trial design options and ensure that we make the design as efficient as possible, moving towards an efficient trial protocol that's feasible and acceptable to stroke survivors and services, and our final objective around disseminating learning. That's partly what I'm doing today. So I believe that you've previously had a seminar on platform trials, so I won't spend too long going over the background, but I'm sure you're aware that there's many benefits from platform trials in terms of efficiency, flexibility, and greater speed of research generation. But the flip side is they are exceedingly complex to design and then implement. And what I want to talk today about is some of the challenges that we've had to work through in relation to how we define the population, how we select interventions, considerations around our control arm, which outcomes are the right ones to include in the platform, and some statistical considerations. And throughout this work, it's been absolutely vital to work in partnership with people who've had a stroke and people that support them. And the PPI input into our platform trial generation has been really relevant in particular areas. So helping us select the right interventions to incorporate into the platform, to think about what outcomes measures matter to stroke survivors and their families, how we develop criteria to look at future interventions that we might want to come into the platform, thinking about barriers to having an inclusive platform and how we might navigate those barriers, and also, as like many trials, looking at how they can support us to develop appropriate patient-facing materials using a multimedia approach. And throughout this work, we've been refining and developing more inclusive PPI approaches that ensure that we're really facilitating diverse involvement from a range of stroke survivors with different needs and different backgrounds. So in terms of some of the sort of design challenges, I just wanted to set the scene in terms of what we mean by platform trials. They're often, the umbrella term of master protocols is often applied to them. Essentially, we're talking about large trials that test multiple interventions across either different patient subgroups or different diseases within a single protocol. We have different types of platform trials. I've put some definitions here on this slide, but I guess most people are thinking we move towards multi-stage platform trials, where we include a number of interventions, but we allow those interventions to be either dropped when it's shown that they're no longer, when we can conclude that they're not really helping participants, or we can add new promising treatments in over time. So in our work, we looked at the available platform designs and really worked through for each of these sorts of designs, which really were appropriate for what we want to do in terms of evaluating stroke rehab interventions. The sorts of questions we had to ask ourselves were, given that we were potentially targeting multiple problems post-stroke, should those interventions target single problems, or should they be able to address multiple problems? And thinking about whether we would need an umbrella design to do that. We needed to think carefully about the control group and thinking about what was the appropriate control arm for each type of intervention. If we could design a trial with a shared control group that was relevant across all the interventions in the platform, that would enable us to undertake a multi-arm, multi-stage trial and maximize the efficiencies in terms of the number of interventions we could evaluate against the number of patients that we needed to recruit. Given that stroke survivors do have multiple needs, we discussed whether it was possible to actually include combinations of interventions, such as in a factorial design, and whether that was feasible for both sites and for stroke survivors to experience. The general conclusion from that was that sites would find that challenging to deliver, especially in terms of staff availability. But stroke survivors as well told us that they probably would prefer to focus on one thing at a time. Because we're trying to design a platform trial in the life after stroke space, which essentially is for the rest of people's lives, one big question is, at what point would be including patients in the platform, and when would they be assigned to the platform interventions? I'll say a little bit more about that in a while. In terms of the platform designs that allow us to assess different interventions based on treating different subgroups, we had to consider, do we want interventions that can be applicable to any stroke survivor, or do we want to design a platform trial where we have intervention specific inclusion criteria? So some people would be eligible for one type of intervention and others might be eligible for another. Obviously that adds additional complexity to the design. And then our final consideration for the sort of overall design was really, do we need to limit the number of interventions? And that really relates to questions of what can we deliver within the UK and the available funding from the funder. Further statistical type design considerations are around the choices we need to make when we're designing the interim analysis plan. So often in platform trials, we examine accumulated data at pre-specified intervals. We test that against predefined stopping rules and make decisions as to whether to continue with an intervention in the platform. So for us, we need to then map those decisions about how we would time, how often we would have those analyses. We had to map those against how quickly we anticipated we would be recruiting patients to a particular arm, and also how long the follow-up was. So for instance, if we thought it would take a year to recruit all the patients to one particular comparison, and our outcome measure was at 12 months, there's no potential for any interim analysis, because by the time we've recruited everyone, we wouldn't have actually collected any outcomes. So the sort of modelling of the recruitment rate against the predicted outcome follow-up time points really helped us work out what was possible in terms of the number of interim analyses, and when to actually implement those analyses. The other thing around the interim analysis design is considering, on what basis are we making a decision to drop or continue with an intervention in the platform. Given the lack of many effective treatments for the life after stroke space, we concluded that it would be of most interest and of most need to continue to include as many promising interventions as possible within the platform. We would not stop early for efficacy, because problems that stroke survivors encounter are multifaceted. We may see a difference on one type of outcome, but maybe on nothing more. And we would want to allow that data to accumulate to the planned end of the trial, so we could understand the full picture of benefits and lack of benefits. And the other thing around our interim analyses considerations is what sort of data do we look at in that interim analysis time point? Do we look at the primary outcome, which often in these sorts of trials takes a long time to accumulate, maybe a year before we see primary outcomes, or do we look for a surrogate for that interim outcome that we can analyse earlier? And in the case of stroke, we don't really have much evidence around what true surrogate outcomes there are for these longer term outcomes, post hospital care type outcomes. Therefore, we had to think about what other outcomes might be related to our longer term outcome, so thinking about the causal pathway for outcome benefit. As I said, the selection rule at interim analysis was influenced by the need to generate as much information about beneficial interventions to really deliver some more evidence in this space. So in terms of our selection rule at that interim analysis stage, we had decided that we would define our selection rule around all promising interventions stay in the platform till final analysis, rather than defining upfront or pre-specifying upfront that we would only retain a certain number and therefore pick the best of those that are analysed at the interim analysis point. In terms of our population, we had a number of questions to work through. Were we going to just recruit stroke survivors, or given that stroke has an impact on families and carers, would we also look to recruit and treat caregivers? For the interest of simplicity, we made the decision that in this first platform trial, we would just recruit stroke survivors. Maybe in the future, we can include carers in the platform, but we really want to get this going and to keep things as simple as we can, even with a complex design. As I said earlier on, a big consideration is how soon after stroke. We hear from stroke survivors that these problems last for many years, and there was a big push for us to be as inclusive as possible in terms of the length of time post-stroke. In terms of settings, we're looking at interventions that can be delivered at home or when people are back in the community rather than hospital-based care. And our big consideration was how we ensure that we recruit not just those that are easy to reach, but those that potentially are not necessarily well served by research, that have communication difficulties or other factors that make them less likely to be included in research. And then finally, in terms of eligibility for the platform population, we needed to look at both platform level inclusion criteria, but also consider which interventions had different eligibility criteria. So it's complex considerations there. In terms of the candidate interventions that we looked at, how we looked at them for the platform, we reviewed the evidence for life after stroke from phase 3 trials undertaken outside of the UK and pilot and feasibility studies undertaken within the UK. And we reviewed them against our predefined checklist, ensuring that they aligned with our priorities, they were individually randomised, and that they had convincing evidence of efficacy or proof of effect, and that they were deliverable in the UK health setting. We then rated the strength of evidence for those interventions, and then from those, through our stakeholder review, we selected 10 for in-depth review, and through discussion, we arrived at mood treatment or mood prevention interventions that aligned with the number one priority from the James Lind Alliance. Through further discussion, we have now selected 5 promising non-pharmacological technologies, and they are the ones that have the strongest evidence of feasibility and acceptability. In terms of platform outcomes, we had a number of questions around looking at how do we define our primary outcome, how do we consider which outcomes are relevant to each intervention, and which intermediate outcomes should inform our trial adaptation. And again, we did this through a research process and discussion with our stakeholders. Looking at the 18 Cochrane reviews that linked to our priority questions, we identified 10 outcome domains that covered a huge number of outcomes. And at our stakeholder meetings, we ranked these for decisions around which were the candidate outcomes for primary outcome. And subsequently, the patient groups reviewed these domains. Their key messages were that fatigue, mood, emotional lability, cognition, and optimized recovery were key for them. In terms of moving from outcome domains to outcome measures, here are some of the considerations that we had to work through, ensuring research efficiency and minimizing participant burden. And across all of these considerations, at the end of the day, what we had to think about was would our collaborators, would our key audience trust the platform evidence that's generated using these outcomes? Would they be willing to accept dropping candidate interventions after interim analysis based on the outcomes that we selected? As I said at the beginning, there was an awful lot of work done within this programme. I can't cover it all in detail. So just another snapshot of another challenge that is particularly relevant for a platform trial that's going to evaluate stroke rehabilitation interventions. And that is a case of process evaluations that look to understand not just whether an intervention works, but how it works, why, for whom, and in which context. Now, within a platform, we're looking at multiple interventions. So here the challenge for the team was to think about, we're not looking at how individual interventions work, but to generate from that process evaluation an overarching theory of how these mood interventions will work after stroke, and then how they can be embedded within the services and how they can be adapted for diverse groups to promote inclusivity. So what does our proposed platform look like? we have decided on a common control, which is treatment as usual. We're testing, as I said previously, interventions to either prevent or treat mood problems. So we have both overall platform eligibility criteria and intervention-specific criteria, because different types of psychological interventions require different inclusion criteria. We have a platform that allows us to have a mix of intervention delivery modes that are matched to the prior feasibility data from each intervention. We have agreed a common outcome set, and we have agreed that poorly performing interventions can be dropped at 2 stages: at the internal pilot stage, based on poor recruitment or acceptability or fidelity, and at interim analysis, just a single interim analysis per intervention, which is time when 50% of the outcome data has been accumulated. So it's a very brief run through of our proposed platform, but what we really think we have the opportunity to do is to lay the tracks for a robust stroke rehabilitation platform infrastructure that really could serve for years to come, act as a future research delivery model, could have an opportunity for capacity building and staff development. Essentially, it's a route to more efficient evidence generation, speeding up the implementation of effective stroke rehabilitation interventions into routine care. And thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for this very nice overview of a new design. I think the platform trial, which has been discussed, as you mentioned, also in earlier seminars, but giving a nice overview how it relates to life after stroke. We'll take questions after all 3 speakers. And I think the next speaker is a nice follow-up, I think, because most of the attendees will probably think already, how can you fund these kind of trials? So I think the next topic is of great interest, and that will be discussed by Marta del Alamo from ECRIN. So ECRIN is a European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network. And Marta has a long experience in doing clinical trials, and she worked in the Spanish Clinical Research Network. But now she's the head of the capacity projects at ECRIN in Paris, and she's focused on coordinating ongoing multinational clinical trials in several European countries. So today she will be talking about the supporting and funding of investigator-initiated multinational trials in Europe from an ECRIN perspective, and also from the Era for Health partnership. So Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robin, for the very kind presentation. I'm gonna share my screen. You can see it in presentation mode?
No, it's not. Yeah, now it is. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will make a very brief presentation about ECRIN first. As Robin said before, ECRIN stands by the European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network. So I will explain how we are supporting multinational clinical trials in Europe. And also I will make also a brief introduction of the Era for Health partnership. That is a way, or it pretends to be a way of funding multinational clinical trials in Europe as well. So just to start, ECRIN is what we call a distributed infrastructure. So it has the status of an ERIC, that is a legal status given by the European Commission to some research infrastructures. And we say that it's distributed because we are actually working with networks of clinical trial units that are located in the different countries that belong to the organization. The map here in the slide shows where are the countries that are right now belong to ECRIN. They are ECRIN member and observer countries. And also I show here where are the different networks that we have in these countries. So as I said, they are clinical trial units that are organized in the different structures and in the different countries. So they already usually exist as a national network before they were joining ECRIN. And the possibility that we have to coordinate multinational clinical trials is because we have this core team that is located in Paris. And then we have European correspondents that are personnel working for ECRIN, for the coordination in Paris, but located in the different countries. And they are our connection with the national partners that are actually the ones that are providing operational support to the investigators and the sponsors to run the clinical trials out of their own country. In addition to all these operational services through the CTUs, ECRIN core team and also our national partners, we are involved in what we call infrastructure development projects or capacity projects that are tools, methods, and partnership that are actually not clinical trials, but are projects that are developing these tools to improve or to improve the clinical research landscape in Europe. This is just an overview of what are the clinical operation services that ECRIN can provide for multinational clinical trials. It goes from the planning stage, in which we can support on the clinical trial design and methodology, also advising you how to get funding sources and making the costing for the clinical trial, and also task distribution for multinational study management, risk assessment, and then once the projects are funded, we can also provide operational coordination for all the services that are necessary to set up the trial, from getting the regulatory and ethical approvals to run the trial, to the monitoring of the trial, vigilance, and data management. These figures here are showing what is the portfolio of ECRIN trials so far, just to show you that we are, would say, specialty agnostic. So we are supporting any type of clinical trials. These are examples of the clinical trials that we have supported since the creation of ECRIN. Most of the topics, I would say, or the medical specialties would be actually related with what is funded at European level, because most of our clinical trials are funded by the European Commission through calls for funding. But what you can see here is that there are many on cardiometabolism, rheumatology, also in neuroscience. And if we talk about the type of intervention, including everything, medicinal products, also advanced therapies, medicinal products, medical devices, and also very important, especially for academic sponsored trials, that are the majority of the trials that we support, procedural intervention, and also diagnostic and non-interventional clinical studies. These are some examples of trials that we have supported in the past. Most of these trials have already finalized, but these are specific on a stroke. And also, as you can see, covering medicinal products as an intervention, but also procedural interventions like EuroHip, proof, and tensions. All those were funded by the European Commission. I think some of them also within the IMI program, that is a collaboration between a collaboration, a partnership, European Commission with industry. And this, I have taken 3 examples of these other projects that I said before that we were funding, involved, that are called capacity projects in 3 different specialties. The first one, the ECRIN project, is already finalized. This project was funded by the European Commission and was coordinated by ECRIN and also by the European Pediatric Clinical Research Infrastructure. And in this project, we developed capacity for multinational pediatric clinical trials. And as I would say, as a result, as a legacy of this project, we have developed some tools that we call pediatric tools. They are published in the ECRIN website, and they include templates, guidelines, recommendations to run trials in pediatrics. The second one, the European Joint Program of Rare Diseases. This is a project that is still running. It's co-funded by the Commission and also with some national funders. And it brings together many, many different partners, including, as I say, funders, but also European reference networks that are networks of clinical research centers specialized in rare diseases, also patients organization like the EURORDIS, that is the European Association of Patients on Rare Diseases. Also, they have developed training activities, etc. In general, just to develop the capacity to, I would say, the landscape of research, clinical research in Europe in rare diseases. As a part of this project, we have also developed the Rare Diseases Clinical Trial Toolbox that is accessible through different websites. I have put here the website of the project itself, the EGP project, but it's also accessible through the ECRIN website. And this one is a compilation of resources that were already developed in the frame of other projects or by organization, etc. All those free and publicly available for all the researchers in an organized way. So what we did was trying to make the line of a clinical trial with all the processes in which that our investigator will have to consider while running a clinical trial and then organize the resources within the different processes. And then the last one, the cancer project, this one is also running right now. It started last year. And this one is a different type of project because this one what brings together is different research infrastructures and other providers of services for oncology related research. And they are available to the scientists in the EU members that are interested in also in research in oncology. And regarding platform trials, I had a nice introduction from the speaker before. As an adaptive platform trial, ECRIN has been involved in the project EUPEL. This project was an IMI funded project, and this project, the mission was developing a generic framework to run platform trials. So it developed a series of tools that would facilitate the running of adaptive platform trials. The result of this project that is already finalized is also a toolbox in which we can find also different templates, recommendations, guidelines, etc., to run adaptive platform trials. On top of this project that was actually on the development of the framework, ECRIN was also involved in providing services for the platform trials. These are some examples of services that we gave to different platforms in COVID, during the COVID pandemic. The first one, ECRIN was a platform to test COVID treatments on primary care patients. The second one, EUResponse, was an adapted platform to test also different interventions in hospitalized, moderate, and severe patients. At the time of, because it started a little bit late, so it didn't really have time to run many different interventions, but at least they ran 2 different interventions, one to repurpose a drug, baricitinib, that is a drug that was already in the market or authorized in treatment in oncology. And also a new drug that was in early development. It was developed by a small company in Norway. The sponsor of this project was Oslo University Hospital. So they also test in the platform this bencentinib drug in a phase 2 platform trial. REMAP-CAP also tested several interventions in ICU patients during the pandemic. It had multiple intervention at the same time in a factorial design, like the one described before. And Vaccelerate also was a platform to test COVID vaccines. So they ran trials for age volunteers, also adult volunteers and pediatric volunteers. And then just in this second part of the intervention, I would like just to talk about how can we fund this type of multinational clinical trials, because we know many initiatives at national level funding or giving funding for trials at national level, but there are not so many opportunities to run a clinical trial at multinational level. Most of the initiatives or the opportunities that we have are coming from a central budget, meaning calls for funding from the Horizon 2020 or the IMI programs in the past. With the new European research program, those are named now Horizon Europe and IHI initiative, the second one in collaboration with industry. These ones probably will launch calls for funding multinational clinical trials, but other than this, there are not so many more opportunities to fund this type of trials. There is then a new possibility, that is the use of national funding. And this opportunity is coming for what we call the co-funded partnerships. These are partnerships that are bringing together national funders, but also with the European Commission. So through this mechanism, they are able to launch with our called joint translational calls, in which the national funding is making a virtual common pot. And then on top of that, they have the co-fund from the Commission to make the call for funding multinational. One example of this partnership is ERA for Health. This ERA for Health consortium is co-funded by the European Commission, and it brings together 34 funding organizations that cover 20 of the actual 27 members of the European Union, plus 3 third countries associated to Northern Europe, that are Israel, Norway, and Turkey, and 2 third countries, Egypt and Taiwan. This consortium brings together even not only national funders, but even regional funders, because in many countries, as you know, funding is also coming at regional level. which makes also even more complicated to bring it to the multinational stage. And also with the additional complication that many of these funders are only funded one type of research. Some of them are specialized in basic research, others are only funding translational research, others are also focused in clinical research, and some of them are able to fund any type of research. So this Era for Health partnership pretends or has the ambition to be a flexible instrument for joint programming in Europe in priority areas. The partners are, as I said, research and innovation funding organization covering not only the national territory, but also at regional level. And the partnership is structured in two phases. There is a first phase in which they are already launching these joint translational calls on 4 priority areas. That the areas are nutrition, diet, and healthy lifestyles, cardiovascular diseases, and nanomedicine. And the second activity, that is where ECRIN is coming into the partnership, that is try to establish a framework for supporting multinational investigator clinical studies in the second phase. So there is these joint translational calls have been launched in the past by these partners through a different partnership, but mostly for preclinical research. There is not so much experience in using this funding mechanism to fund multinational investigator-initiated clinical studies, and this is a challenge. And this is the part in which we are now trying to set up the framework to be able to launch in the future, in the phase 2, these calls on multinational clinical studies. These are 2 examples of the joint translational calls that the project has launched so far, mostly on preclinical research. There was one on cardiovascular diseases that is already closed. The second one was in a healthy lifestyle. And there was a third one that was launched just last week in nanomedicine. And here is just a summary of what we are preparing now. As I said, is like we are trying to discuss now with the partners working on the design phase, with the idea that in the end of next year, we will be able to propose funding mechanism or a framework to fund multinational clinical studies, considering, for instance, that this type of partnerships are usually using a 70% as a common pot of the total funding. That is what is funded at national level or by the national funders, plus 30% that is the contribution from the European Commission. But then also discussing what should be the eligibility criteria of these calls, what should be the selection criteria, how we select the projects that will be funded. Also, we have really to take into account that so far these joint translational calls, they are not very flexible on the moving of the money, because this is a virtual common pot, and also what type of supporting measures we can implement or we can suggest to try to help the investigators to propose feasible and good projects for these joint translational calls. And I think this is all on my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Funding is an important question for all of us, and I think you've given us a very nice overview of the support ECRIN can provide and the possibilities of funding. Before we move on, we would want to let you know that the webinar, of course, will be available on demand on the ESOTA website in some days. Now, moving on to research methodology. Our last speaker of today is Anita Lindmark. Anita is an associate professor of statistics at the Umeå University in Sweden. She primarily works within causal mediation analysis with applications related to register-based studies of inequalities in stroke care and outcome. Anita, we are very much looking forward to hearing about your experience. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I will share my screen. Let's see. There, I hope you can see it. And I'll change my pointer as well. There. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk about mediation analysis for identification of direct and indirect causal effects. And this is quite a broad topic. And I don't have that much time, so I've had to narrow it down. So I'll be focusing on giving a very brief introduction to causal mediation analysis, and with a focus on effect definitions and assumptions. And I won't have time to get into estimation methods today, unfortunately. And I'll be giving two examples from a research project called Uncovering the Mechanisms Behind Socioeconomic Inequalities in Stroke Care and Outcome through Innovative Statistical Methods for Mediation Analysis. And this project is in collaboration with the Swedish Stroke Register. So these examples are not trials-based, but the concepts that I'll be talking about are very general. So let's get into the general setting for a mediation analysis. We have some exposure or a treatment or an intervention of some kind, and we have an outcome of interest. And in between these two, we have our mediator. And often we're interested in partitioning the total effect of the exposure on the outcome into an indirect effect, which is the effect of the exposure on the outcome that operates through the mediator, and a direct effect, which is the effect of the exposure on the outcome that does not operate through the mediator. In a trial, this could be useful if you have some mechanism in mind between the intervention and the outcome that you can explore via such an intermediate variable. And causal mediation analysis is an approach that has really come into vogue in the past 2 decades or so. And it has some advantages, among which are that we define these direct and indirect effects in a model-free way, so they're not tied to specific statistical models, which allows us to be quite flexible in the settings where we can estimate effects, and also the estimation methods that we can use. And also that the assumptions that we need to make to be able to estimate these effects from our observed data are clearly stated. So let's get into the first example, and this is from an article that was published in 2020. And here we wanted to look at the relationship between income level and survival after stroke, and the extent to which differences in stroke severity could account for differences in survival. So here we had as our exposure having low income, and our outcome was death within 3 months after stroke. And our hypothesis was that the increased risk of death within 3 months that we saw among low-income patients in part could be explained by them having more severe strokes, and stroke severity was measured through level of consciousness at hospital arrival. And in the article, we write that we focus on a decomposition of the total effect into the natural indirect effect and the natural direct effect. And these two are probably the most commonly seen effects in causal mediation analysis when we want to focus on decomposing the total effect. So let's have a look at how they are defined. And I'll give a general definition, and then I'll give examples based on our study. And in these general definitions, let's say that we want to decompose an effect of the exposure, of shifting the exposure from some level A to a different level B on the outcome. Then the natural indirect effect, or NIE, would be the average change in the outcome if the mediator were, for each individual, were changed from its level under exposure level A to its value under exposure level B, but the exposure itself were fixed at one level, for example, B. So the idea here is that we're only allowing the exposure to have an effect on the outcome through the mediator. We're allowing the mediator to change according to different exposure levels, but by fixing the exposure itself, we're not allowing it to have this direct effect on the outcome. And in our study, this would be the average change in risk of death within 3 months if level of consciousness for each patient were changed from its level if that patient did not have low income to its level if that patient had low income, so from unexposed to exposed, but income were fixed at low income here. And in the general case, the natural direct effect, or NDE, can be defined as the average change in the outcome if exposure were changed from level A to level B, while for each individual, the mediator were kept at the level that it would have taken under a fixed exposure level, for example, A. And I've written A here and B here. It could be the other way around, but these have to be opposite of each other. Otherwise, these two won't add up to the total effect. So the idea with the NDE is that we're letting the exposure shift from level A to level B. So we're allowing this direct effect, but we're not allowing the exposure to have an indirect effect on the outcome through the mediator because we're not allowing the exposure to have an effect on the mediator. And in our study, this would be the average change in risk of death within 3 months if income were changed from not low income to low income, while for each patient, level of consciousness were kept at its level under not low income. So these effects are defined under hypothetical scenarios that we actually couldn't ever observe in reality. But under certain assumptions, we can estimate them from our observed data. And those assumptions are first temporality. We need to make sure that the exposure comes before the mediator, which in turn comes before the outcome in time. Consistency and positivity I won't go into, but they are needed to connect these hypothetical values to observed values. And finally, we have unconfoundedness, which I'll talk a bit more about. And the first part of these unconfoundedness assumptions is that we can't have unobserved confounding of the relationships between the exposure and outcome, the exposure and the mediator, and between the mediator and the outcome. And if we have a trial where we've randomized the exposure or the intervention, ideally, we won't have issues with these two types of confounding. But this mediator outcome confounding is difficult to safeguard against. So it's important generally to perform some kind of sensitivity analysis when you do a mediation. So let's go back to this example and look at some results. And this is for intracerebral hemorrhage. And we found that the estimated total effect was a 3.2% increased absolute risk of death within 3 months for low-income patients compared to patients who did not have low income. And of that total effect, 1.8% was an indirect effect via lowered consciousness at hospital arrival. But this estimate is under the assumption that we don't have unobserved confounding. And like I just said, it's difficult to guarantee. So we wanted to look at how our estimated effects would be affected by unobserved confounders. So we performed a sensitivity analysis. And this is a picture from the article. And this is using a method that I developed with some colleagues, but there are many different ways that you can do this. And I'll modify this figure a little bit to make it easier to understand. So here we have the natural indirect effect, and this is for mediator outcome confounding. And here in the middle, we have under the assumption that there is no unobserved confounding. So our 1.8% estimate. And if we go out to either side, we have stronger and stronger unobserved confounding. And to this side, we have unobserved confounding affecting the mediator and outcome in the same directions. And on this side, we have unobserved confounding affecting the mediator and outcome in opposite directions. And what we see in our figure is how the estimated effect would change if we could additionally adjust for unobserved confounding of different strengths. And we can see that if we have relatively strong unobserved confounding affecting the mediator and outcome in the same directions, our NIE could be no longer significant. So this type of analysis gives us an idea of how sensitive or robust our results are to unobserved confounding. So moving on to the second part of these unconfounded assumptions, in addition to having to assume no unobserved confounding of exposure, mediator, and outcome relationships, we also have to assume that there are no intermediate confounders. So no mediator outcome confounder that is also affected by the exposure. And this one is even trickier because it doesn't matter if we observe these or not, if we adjust for them or not. If these are present, then the NIE and NDE with regards to the mediator are not identifiable. So that leads me into the second example. Here we wanted to look at the effect of low SES on death or dependency in ADL at 3 months after stroke. And we wanted to look at a whole bunch of different mediators or mediator groups. And the temptation here is to perform separate mediation analysis with regards to each mediator and to estimate the NIE and NDE with regards to each mediator separately. But this will not give correct results because the other mediators will then act as these intermediate confounders. And here we also wanted to estimate the effects via these different mediators without having to make strong causal assumptions regarding the ordering, which also includes having to assume that there are no unobserved confounders between the mediators. So we moved on from these natural indirect and direct effects to an alternative that has been developed in recent years called interventional indirect effects, where instead of setting the mediator to its natural value for each patient, if that patient had been under a given exposure level, as we do with these NIE and NDE, we set the mediator for each patient to a randomly drawn value from its distribution under a given exposure level when we define these effects. And we need to make similar assumptions to the NIE and NDE, but we don't have to make this assumption that there are no intermediate confounders. So these types of effects are more appropriate when we have multiple mediators. And in our study, we used a variant of these interventional effects called interventional disparity indirect effects, which have also been developed in recent years. And briefly, what we found was that around 40% of the low SES death or dependency in ADL at 3 months association could be eliminated if we could intervene to change the distributions of all of the mediators of patients with low SES to those of more privileged patients. And we also looked at each individual mediator and found that the largest reduction could be accomplished by equalizing the distributions of stroke severity as measured by NIHSS. And if you're interested in more details around these results, this study was recently published in Neurology. So you can check that out. And that's all I have time for today. So thank you for your attention. Here are 2 references that I think are good if you're interested in finding out more about different types of direct and indirect effects and their pros and cons in different settings. Yes, so thank you.
Thank you, Anita, for this very interesting and I think for some maybe at least for myself rather complicated views of very, very interesting research questions, I think. So for the sake of time, I think I want to wait to see some questions from the audience, but I wanted to kick off with a question for Marta. Just for the attendees, potentially, if they're thinking about looking for funding and want to involve ECRIN in their process, what would be the most appropriate timing? I mean, would this be already in advance before thinking about the actual design and the network, or should it only be if you have a proper design and then you have your network and then go to ECRIN? So what would be the most optimal timing, you think?
It would be the sooner the better. Usually it's like we have usually the restriction that the people not right away contact us when the call for funding is out. But for me, it's like as soon as you know that there is a call for funding and you are interested, just contact us because also it's like all the advice at the beginning is done for free, at least for ECRIN member and observer countries. So then to provide the services, obviously we have to be part of the consortium, etc. But just for the initial advice, this is provided for free.
Yeah. So I also have a question for Amanda. So how do you see such a platform trial moving forward? Because you have a lot of interventions and typically for funding there's limited time. So how do you look at that for like a continuous or sustainable platform trial design? Because you set up all this infrastructure again, but now for a platform trial. But if funding runs out, how do you see that moving on further?
Yeah, it's a really great question. We're really fortunate in the UK that the National Institute of Health Research has recognised that actually platform trials, although, as you say, they are incredibly expensive, they actually offer very good value for money. So they have put out a call this summer, and the deadline is next week, for platform trials that are addressing areas of strategic importance to our National Health Service. So that is the funding call that we're aiming for. They have said funding is unlimited. Well, they've said there's no specific limit to funding, but they have said these are not perpetual platform trials. They do have to have a finite lifetime and a finite number of interventions. So yeah, we're making progress. We're never going to get to the stage where we can fund these indefinitely, but certainly the level of funding in the UK is recognised that it needs to be greater, and there is this specific call. So I hope I take all your good wishes for a successful bid.
I might just follow on that, Amanda, just in general, because platform trials make it very flexible, so you can add interventions, you can even add further subpopulations. What do you think? Do you think there is kind of a limit per country, let's say, for platform trials? For example, you are doing a platform, or you plan a platform trial on stroke and rehabilitation. How many of these platform trials do you need per country? Because you can add all the interventions into your one platform already. Do you think that it would make sense to have a limit there, or how will that be in the future?
I mean, that is, maybe a sky's the limit type ambition that, if we get the funding to set up this platform trial and we actually recruit patients much more swiftly and more efficiently into this research, it may act as a mechanism for future trialists to come along, apply for additional funding, not as big as a standalone trial, but to sort of bolt on to the mechanism of this platform trial. But I think that may be a future ambition. Our target at the moment is to win the funding for the trial that we're setting out with 5 interventions. We don't want to sort of overpromise, but I think within the stroke research community in the UK, there's a definite willingness that this could work. This could be the new way of doing future trials, and essentially we could bolt on additional evaluations over time. But I don't want us to overpromise. I want us to be able to deliver something that actually moves us forwards in stroke rehab research. So yeah, the ultimate ambition would be as you described, but I think we've got to win the funding first and actually deliver what we set out to do, which is a big enough job as it is.
This I can believe. Thank you, and we wish you all the best of luck for that.
Thank you.
I've got another question for Anita. So from what you've described, which was really, really interesting, I understand actually you can theoretically calculate everything. What do you think? Which question would be most appropriate for this method?
I'm not sure if I understand the.
So theoretically, you can answer every question. You can calculate everything. For which research question do you think your method is most appropriate?
Well, I've only sort of scratched the surface now, but I think for the ones that I was describing in the presentation, I think it's most appropriate if you have a certain mechanism in mind and you're able to measure variables related to those mechanisms, then it's interesting to do a mediation analysis.
Including large registries and large cohorts, I suppose.
Yeah, well, ideally, yes. I think it's always, because it is quite complicated. Mediation analysis, even in the simplest case, is quite complicated. So it's always a good idea to think about it already in the design stage, and to, of course, have a statistician involved that can help you think through all of these complicated parts.
Yeah, thank you very much. And
so I think there's one question from one of the attendees, Rustam Salman asked. I think it's mostly directed towards Amanda. We need more research on research to understand how to do it best. Would a study within a study be done within a platform trial, or is that too complicated?
Hi, Rustam. Yeah, this is one of my pet projects as well, doing our research better, not only having more efficient design. So certainly I would be a big advocate of ensuring that we bolt on small methodological studies that help us understand how to do trials more efficiently, how we do trial conduct more efficiently. And certainly in our application, we have done something around that. In the UK, there's a particular interest in more diversity and sort of broader inclusion. So that's what we're particularly focusing on our LEAP platform. But thank you. Yeah.
All right. I think if there are no further questions, this will be the end of this webinar. I would like to hand over to Jean-Marc Oliveau to say some final words.
I would like to thank you all for your attendance and for the great talk and for the moderation. Thank you. This gave us lots of new insight about how to set up the future of our research. And we are inviting you to our next session, which will be for the first time a teaching session embedded into the ESOC conference in Basel in May. Thank you again, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.